Father Michael Carter had been delivering sermons at St. Augustine Church in Chicago for over a decade. His voice, steady and full of conviction, had guided his congregation through faith, doubt, and redemption. That Sunday morning seemed no different until he noticed something unusual. Among the rows of devoted listeners, Sister Mary stood out, not because of her presence, but because of her unsettling stillness. Her eyes, usually filled with warmth and devotion, now seemed distant, almost vacant. At first, Father Michael thought she was simply deep in prayer. But as the sermon went on, a chilling realization crept over him. Something was terribly wrong. Father Michael tried to keep his focus on the sermon, but his gaze kept returning to Sister Mary. Her body remained perfectly still, but there was an unsettling energy in the air. The usual hum of the congregation seemed to fade, and he could feel his pulse quicken as he continued speaking. Midway through his homily, the unthinkable happened. Sister Mary slowly stood up from her seat without a word, her eyes still fixed on something in the distance, her movements eerily stiff. The congregation fell silent, confused and uncertain of what was happening. Father Michael's voice faltered, but he quickly regained his composure, trying to dismiss the strange occurrence as a mere distraction. However, as Sister Mary began to walk toward the altar, a sense of dread filled the room. Her steps were deliberate, almost robotic, and the air around her seemed charged with an unnatural presence. The normally serene atmosphere of the church had turned tense, the peaceful silence replaced by an uneasy murmur of whispers. As she reached the altar, Sister Mary stopped. For a moment, she stood completely still. Then, without any warning, she fell to her knees, her hands gripping the edge of the altar as if she were holding on for dear life. The whole congregation gasped. Father Michael, his heart pounding, rushed to her side. "Sister, what's happening?" he asked, his voice trembling. But before she could respond, something even stranger occurred. A soft, otherworldly whisper echoed throughout the church, the words unintelligible, yet filled with a deep, foreboding energy. The lights flickered briefly, and Father Michael felt a cold chill sweep over him. Sister Mary's body jerked, her face contorting as if she were caught in some invisible struggle. Father Michael reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. It was ice cold to the touch. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the church returned to its usual stillness. Sister Mary's body relaxed, her eyes clearing as if nothing had happened. She slowly rose to her feet, and the tension in the room dissipated as quickly as it had come. The congregation sat in stunned silence, unsure of what to make of what they had just witnessed. Father Michael, his mind racing, could barely find the words to continue his sermon. He was shaken to the core, unable to comprehend what had just occurred. It wasn't until after the service that he was able to speak with Sister Mary privately. But when he asked her about the strange episode, she simply smiled faintly and said, "Sometimes, Father, the Lord's mysteries are not for us to understand." And so the mystery remained, unsolved and shrouded in silence. Father Michael sat across from Sister Mary in his small office, the wooden crucifix on the wall casting a long shadow in the dim evening light. The church had emptied hours ago, yet the unease from the morning's events lingered like a heavy fog. He studied Sister Mary carefully. She looked exhausted but otherwise normal. No sign of distress, no fear, just an odd calmness that made him even more uneasy. "Sister," he said gently, "you frightened everyone today. Do you remember what happened?" She hesitated, fingers lightly tracing the edge of her habit. I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "One moment, I was listening to your sermon, and the next, it was as if something else took over." Father Michael leaned forward. "Something else?" She swallowed hard, glancing toward the office window, where the last traces of daylight were fading. "It felt like I wasn't alone in my own body," she finally said. "Like something was watching through me." A chill ran down Father Michael's spine. He had encountered moments of deep spiritual intensity before, moments where faith and the unexplained intertwined. But this was different. "Sister Mary, has this ever happened before?" She hesitated again, but then nodded. "Once," she whispered, "when I was a child." Father Michael's breath caught in his throat. "Tell me," he urged. She took a shaky breath. "I grew up in a small town in Louisiana. My family was deeply religious, and my grandmother always told us stories about spirits, good ones and bad ones. One summer, when I was 10, I started waking up in the middle of the night, feeling like someone was standing in my room. First, I thought it was my imagination, but then the voices started." Father Michael's fingers tightened around the armrest of his chair. "What kind of voices?" Sister Mary lowered her eyes. "Whispers. Sometimes they were soft, other times urgent. They spoke in a language I didn't understand. My grandmother said it was an old tongue, something ancient. She prayed over me every night, and eventually, the voices stopped." Father Michael exhaled slowly, processing what she had just revealed. "And now they're back?" She nodded. "I don't know why, but today, when I stood up in the church, I swear I wasn't moving on my own." A heavy silence settled between them. Father Michael's mind raced through the possibilities. Was this a spiritual attack, a possession, or something else entirely? Then, just as he was about to speak, the room grew unbearably cold. The candle beside them flickered violently before snuffing out, plunging them into near darkness. And then they heard it. A whisper, low, distant, but unmistakably real. Not from Sister Mary. Not from Father Michael. From somewhere else in the room. They both froze. Then, in a voice that was not her own, Sister Mary whispered, "He's here." Father Michael's breath hitched. His heart pounded against his ribs as the whisper faded into the heavy silence of the room. He stared at Sister Mary. Her expression remained vacant, her lips slightly parted as if she had only been a vessel for the voice. "Sister Mary," he began cautiously, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Who is he?" She didn't answer immediately. Her hands, resting on her lap, had begun to tremble. Then, as if suddenly waking from a trance, she gasped and clutched her head. "I don't know," she whispered, shaking. "I don't know what's happening to me." Father Michael stood up and reached for the crucifix on his desk. "We need to pray," he said firmly. Sister Mary nodded, but as soon as he began reciting a prayer, the temperature in the room dropped even further. The wooden walls groaned. The candle that had been snuffed out reignited on its own with an unnatural blue flame. Then the whisper returned. But this time it was closer. He sees you. The voice slithered through the room like a serpent, wrapping itself around them, filling the space with an unseen presence. Sister Mary gasped and lurched forward, gripping the arms of her chair. Her eyes were wide with terror. Father, it's him. It's the same voice from my childhood. Father Michael gripped the crucifix tighter, raising it toward her as he began an exorcism prayer. His voice was strong, unwavering, but deep inside, fear clawed at his faith. He had dealt with strange occurrences before, but this was something beyond his understanding. Sister Mary let out a strangled gasp, her body convulsing slightly before she collapsed to the floor. For a moment, everything was still. Then, a deep, guttural voice, not hers, spoke from her lips. You do not belong here. Father Michael staggered backward. In the name of Christ, I command you, who are you? The thing inside Sister Mary chuckled, a sound that didn't belong to her at all. I have always been here. The room trembled. Books fell from the shelves. The candle flickered wildly before going out again, plunging them into darkness. And then silence. Sister Mary's body went limp. Father Michael rushed to her side, shaking her gently. Sister, wake up. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion replacing the horror that had been there moments before. What happened? He exhaled in relief but knew this was far from over. Something ancient had just made itself known, and it wasn't done with them yet. As he helped Sister Mary to her feet, he realized one thing: this wasn't just a case of spiritual disturbance. This was a warning, and whatever had been watching them was still here. Father Michael locked the office door and helped Sister Mary into a chair. Though her body had stopped shaking, her face remained pale, her breathing uneven. Father, she whispered, clutching the edge of the desk. It's happening again, just like before. Father Michael grabbed his Bible, flipping through the pages, searching for the right scripture. He needed guidance, something to anchor them both. The presence in the room had subsided, but he knew it hadn't left completely. This isn't over, he muttered. Sister Mary lifted her gaze to him. What do we do? He hesitated. The church had strict procedures for these matters. Report the incident to the diocese, consult with an exorcist, conduct an investigation. But Father Michael had a sinking feeling that by the time the bureaucracy caught up, it would be too late. He needed answers. Now, he placed a hand on Sister Mary's shoulder. Tell me about the last time this happened, when you were a child. What do you remember? She swallowed hard. It started small, whispers at night, shadows moving where they shouldn't. My grandmother told me it was a spirit, an old one. She paused, her fingers tightening into fists. One night, I woke up and something was in my room. I don't know what it was, but I couldn't move, couldn't scream. It just stood there, watching me. Father Michael's grip on the Bible tightened. Did it ever speak? She hesitated, then nodded. Yes, it said the same thing it did tonight. I have always been here. The words sent a chill down Father Michael's spine. He looked toward the window, half expecting to see something lurking in the dark. Did your grandmother do anything? A ritual? A prayer? She prayed over me every night, burned blessed incense, Read from the Psalms. Sister Mary exhaled shakily. And then, one night, it just stopped. Father Michael frowned. Until now. Sister Mary's expression darkened. Yes, and I think I know why. She reached into the pocket of her habit and pulled out a small, faded envelope. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges. She handed it to him with trembling fingers. I found this last night, tucked inside my prayer book. It wasn't there before. Father Michael carefully unfolded the letter. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. It was addressed to her. My child, you do not remember, but you were chosen long ago. You belong to something greater, something older than all of this. It is time to remember. There was no signature, only a symbol at the bottom of the page, an unfamiliar mark, a perfect circle with jagged lines cutting through it. Father Michael felt the blood drain from his face. He had seen that symbol before, not in any church, but in an old, forbidden text deep within the Vatican archives. And it was never meant to be spoken of. He looked up at Sister Mary, his voice barely above a whisper. This is not just a spirit. She stared at him, fear creeping back into her features. Then what is it? Father Michael slowly closed the letter, his hands slightly shaking. It's something much older than we thought. Father Michael placed the letter on the desk, his fingers still gripping its fragile edges. The symbol at the bottom sent a cold wave through him. He had seen it once before, years ago, in a restricted section of the Vatican archives, a sigil tied to an ancient order, one that had been erased from most records. They called themselves the Keepers of the Veil. According to what little he had read, they were not worshippers of God nor followers of the devil. They were something else entirely, guardians of knowledge too dangerous for mankind to possess. And their teachings spoke of something older than heaven and hell. Something that had always been here. Sister Mary watched him closely. Father, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. What does it mean? Father Michael exhaled slowly. It means, this was never just a spirit haunting you. He turned the letter toward her, pointing at the symbol. Someone or something has been watching you since you were a child. Sister Mary's face went pale. But why? I don't understand. A sudden knock at the office door made them both jump. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Father Michael and Sister Mary exchanged a look. The church had been locked hours ago. No one should have been able to enter. The candle on the desk flickered violently. The air in the room grew heavier, as if something unseen had entered with them. Then, a voice from the other side of the door, a voice they both recognized. You do not belong here. Sister Mary gasped. It's him. Father Michael's breath caught in his throat. He grabbed the crucifix from his desk, his fingers tightening around it until his knuckles turned white. Stay behind me, he whispered. The door handle twisted slowly. With a silent prayer, Father Michael stepped forward and swung the door open. But there was nothing there. Only darkness. Only silence. The air felt impossibly still, the hallway stretching out into the empty church like a tunnel leading into the unknown. Then, without warning, the candle beside them went out. Sister Mary gasped in the darkness, reaching for Father Michael's arm. He held his breath, listening, waiting. And then, Just beyond the threshold, barely louder than a whisper, a breath, right next to his ear. His blood ran cold. Sister Mary let out a choked sob. "Father, it's still here." Father Michael swallowed hard. "No," he said, gripping the crucifix tighter. "It never left." A sudden gust of wind howled through the church, slamming the office door shut. The candle reignited on its own, its flame no longer golden but a deep, unnatural blue. And then, in the flickering light, they saw it. Standing in the far corner of the room. A figure, tall, shrouded in shadow, its face hidden. Watching. Waiting. And then, in a voice that did not belong to this world, it spoke. "She is ours." The room plunged into total darkness. Sister Mary screamed. And the last thing Father Michael heard before the world was swallowed whole was the sound of his own breath being stolen away.